Hi, and welcome to this week's Mortgage Broker broadcast. This week's podcast is the second episode in the Habits series that Leigh Rowland and I have done. And yeah, we've obviously last week we talked about the difference between New Year's resolutions and habits and why habits beat New Year's resolutions every single time. And so we did say we're going to sort of split this down and get into a bit more detail with various things within habits and follow a bit of a process, really. So last week we talked about understanding New Year's resolutions and why habits beats New Year's resolutions every single time. We then talked a little bit about the science of habits and got into detail about that. And then so this week we wanted to talk about the power of small wins and why consistency is the key. So let's just get Leigh onto the podcast. So welcome back onto the podcast, Leigh. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Craig. Feeling a bit more switched on than I was on the last one, because I think it was the first hour we were back in work from the Christmas break. And but I am, back literally feeling great this morning. It's been a great morning, and thanks for inviting me back on. Really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you coming back on. And obviously this is week 2 of the 4-week series that we said we were going to do about habits, and I appreciate you coming back on. And I'm glad I think you're doing yourself a bit of a disservice there by saying you weren't as switched on the first episode, but we will see, won't we? We can judge. New lighting as well in the office there. I can see from this from this view.
I looked like I was in a shadow last time, and you obviously look consistent because that's where you're big on consistency. So I bought myself a light which attaches to the top of my laptop to give us a bit more light. So hopefully people can, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. People can see me a bit better now anyway.
Yeah, we can. Certainly see that face of yours in better light.
Yeah.
So thank you for, like I said, agreeing to come back on. With the first podcast we did, episode 1 was obviously about, and you was quite defensive. You backed up resolutions a few times, so we did. I've clipped a few of those bits about you being defensive with regards to resolutions a little bit. But yeah, no, I think we talked about resolutions. We talked about the science behind habits in terms of it. So we ticked off. We sort of said we've got 7 things to talk about, 8 things to talk about habits. Obviously, we've done the first 2. This one now is looking at the power of small wins and why and how consistency is key. And I think it just follows on nicely in terms of, we've talked about resolutions. We've talked about the difference between resolutions and habits. We've talked about the science behind habits and why habits will always trump resolutions every single time. And it's quite funny, actually, because you are doing yourself a bit of disservice in terms of the first podcast, because I know there's a few people commenting on the podcast on various social media platforms, but I've had quite a few direct messages as well about the podcast in terms of that. Because you know what, sometimes, and how it works is that, and I understand this, is people don't want to put comments on social media about the podcast. They don't want to have that outward comment and that public display, shall we say? Is that the right word? The right word?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
But they would rather send me messages in terms of, and I've had quite a few questions about, not questions, just questions around like the differences and the why habits are. And
wow.
A few people, like, as you referred to habit stacking, I've had a few things about that, because I thought you referred to that in the first podcast, and it always goes back to Atomic Habits, the book. And a few people have sort of said, I re-picked that book. I've read that book already, but I've re-picked it back up on the back of the podcast, which is just awesome. That is like such a powerful thing that we so you're doing yourself a disservice, mate. You did well in the first podcast.
Well, that's brilliant news. That's what the podcast is all about, isn't it? That's actually fantastic. Oh, mate, I'm blown away by that, and I'm just glad that maybe it made people think a little bit then by my input and your input and a chat. That's fantastic. Exactly. Great news. I got Atomic Habits over. It's over there. Yeah, I've started it. I haven't finished it, but I think you're the expert on habit stacking, not me. I just brought it up because I remember you. I do listen to your podcast when I'm not on them as well, because I'm sure that I heard it on your podcast and listened to it. So you're the expert on that, not me. I just brought it up. That's all.
No, you didn't. To be fair, we're not picking up on habit stacking in this podcast, but it's a great topic to talk about, because then it's an easy thing to do. So yeah, maybe it's something that we pick up later on down the line, in terms of once people have got habits and looking at the way that they're doing things this year, and the small changes that they're making. It's then how you build on those small changes to keep that momentum going, and make them have those big changes in terms of their daily structure, the daily habits, weekly habits from there. So, but yeah, the idea of this podcast is then to pick up onto the next two topics we want to talk about, which is, funny enough, you mentioned you dropped the C-in word before, but C-in word before, but it was consistency, which you talked about. But I think that's the thing, is we want to talk about the small wins and consistency. But I think the thing is that it's like you there, like we're talking, funny enough, what we just talked about there was a small win on the podcast. Us getting comments and us getting feedback and us making people change are the small wins of the podcast, aren't they? That's ironically what we want to talk about, because they're the things, that's what keeps you going. It's not sort of like we want to have 500 listeners, downloads, or subscribers to the podcast. It's those little bits of snippets of things that actually they are the small wins.
Yeah, and well, the feeling that I just got actually live on this podcast, and if people do watch it, they'll see I sort of went a little bit red and flushed. That nice, warm feeling, which all human beings like, was from the feedback from having a small win. And I think that's the importance of the small win, is trying to get that human emotion of pleasure is a bit of a weird word, isn't it? A satisfaction from getting a small win, which then propels us to the next small win. And then you build it up gradually. And I think that's just happened to me live, hasn't it? It's just happened to me live.
Yeah. So, and we didn't script that at all. We haven't even talked about that before the podcast.
No, this worked out quite well, hasn't it?
Absolutely. But I think that's the thing, is we try to go big, don't we? We go big with everything. It's like go big or go home, or like it's just, that's the whole world thing, kind of concept and mindset that a lot of people in, is I have to go big. And I'm just not comfortable with that. I think it's just like, it's okay going big. It's all right doing that. But it's how it's sort of a few weeks in of going big, and we don't feel as though we're getting anywhere. It's like, well, I can't be bothered anymore. Like, it's not a thing. Whereas if we go like the small wins, having those little, and focusing on the small wins and making the sort of, it just then that will, having those small wins gives us the confidence. Like you've got the confidence to come back onto the podcast. And not that you didn't have the confidence anyway, but you'll have the confidence to come back on the podcast and go, do you know what? That's a small win. I want to be back on there now. That's a natural thing. Whereas if you sort of said the big goal is we want 500 comments, it's like, well, we've only had 4 or 5. Like what? Yeah. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like, that's not the point.
It's setting tangible goals, isn't it? Because if you can see it, feel it, and it can be reachable, once you get there, the feeling of satisfaction is amazing. But then you can set the next one then, which builds on top of that one, can't you? I've done it. I've said loads of times, let's go big or go home, and I have done it. I think nobody can say they haven't really, especially if they're in business. Come on, let's get at it, isn't it? But I think as long as you can have an overall thought or a goal, can you? You've always got to break it down into small chunks, which are achievable. Otherwise, be so hard just to. I mean, you say no, run your own race isn't the right thing. Is plow your own trough or something, isn't it? When you deviate so much from that as you were trying to get to right at the end, like a resolution, that it would take you so long if you actually did get there, that the path would be winding, wouldn't it? But if you have small wins, medium wins, then the path could be straighter because you can monitor it as you go in rather than swerving all over the place trying to get there. And you probably won't, unless you're so strong-minded, you probably won't get there anyway if it's a big whimsical sort of resolution, stroke, thought or aspiration. It'd be really tough without planning it properly.
You're right. I think with regards to this, running your own race, ploughing your own field, by the way. I think that's the
Your own field. That's what it is.
Ploughing your own trough. I'm not sure about that.
I don't know. Oh, mate, honestly, sorry about that. I was trying. It's hard when you're live.
Ploughing your own field. No, but
That's
I think
it.
you're absolutely right. Running your own race, ploughing your own field. We feel as though that's the whole thing with running your own race. It is your field that you've got to plough. It's your business. It's your personal circumstances. It's your life. That's exactly what it is. So when you go in and start thinking, oh, I need to, it can just be intimidating. It's just, like if you're too bothered about what other people, oh, Mike, I'm going to do 500,000 this year. I'm going to do 1 million. No, I'm going to do 1.5. No, I'm going to do 2. It's just like, oh my God, like, don't get distracted by those sort of overwhelming, lofty. The word I used before in the first podcast was lofty, and I like that. I'm into that. The lofty goals that people feel as though they need to do, rather than actually really break it. Everything I do and talk about is about breaking down. Whether if you've got an annual target you want to achieve, break it down by month, break it down by week, break it down every single day.
Yeah.
Because then it just becomes, it makes it more achievable. It looks far less intimidating, and you can see those wins. And if you are breaking down and you're not achieving what you want, you're not achieving or on the right, you're not even in the right field. Never mind on the right plowing the right line. Is then you can tweak and make quick changes to then make sure you get you back on track, rather than going, oh well, that's my goal. I'm sort of getting there, but because then it's just daily, weekly habits just makes such a. I get so passionate about these things because it's just frustrates me when I see those lofty things that people are publicizing on social media, saying I'm doing this and I've done 50 mortgages and I've done. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, why are you creating distractions for everybody else, boosting your own ego? So I've gone off on a total tangent now in terms of the podcast, but
I'll try and bring it back now. I've got one in the bag to bring it back.
Go for it.
What you're touching on there then is the next bit, and is the consistency. If you're on about weekly or daily, weekly, monthly. So what you've said there is that you need consistency in order to create the habits, in order to get the small wins, in order to form the habit, which should lead you then to the overall aspiration if you do it properly. Is that what you're trying to get at? The consistency is very important.
Definitely. It comes hand in hand, does it? Like,
yes.
If you're getting those small wins, will enforce the consistency and vice versa. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah. Wow. That's quality. That's spot on. Absolutely spot on. Because otherwise, go on after you.
No. Go on,
We're polite, didn't we? We're too polite.
We get too passionate about these things. We get too.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, it's like if you don't break it down into smaller chunks and you're not consistent, then you might go all in for 3 weeks. I mean, you might literally go all in for 3 weeks on something, anything. Let's not name it, 'cause it could be fitness, eating, dieting, work, whatever, can it?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, then it's such a shock to your system, you don't want to do it anymore, and you bin it off, which is what we're talking about with resolutions. But if you, like you said, if you're consistently reviewing, monitoring, adapting on a consistent basis, and I think you said it was over 20, the habit comes over 21 days-ish. 7 to 21, I beg your pardon. Then you've got a good chance that that's going to settle in. And that's consistency. Now we're moving from wins to consistency. The consistency is very, very important in anything, isn't it? Absolutely massive.
It is. And I think that's the thing is with it, when you look at setting the goals and looking at setting the daily, weekly, they're more likely to happen. You get more likely to get the consistency there if you are, like I put a clip from last week's podcast, and I think it was Louis Adkins commented on about it, sort of saying, and I put the clip on of you talking about the great example you used about social media and he sort of commented about the consistency of that is that, and going back to the 7 to 21 that you talked about on the last week's podcast, is that do it twice a week, then do it 3 times a week, then do it 4, and then you'll be doing it 5 times a week, and then you will create that habit. It is, if you set that stall out from the day one of, right, I'm going to post 5 times a day, but you're not even 5 times a week, but you're not even posting at this time at all. You're going from nothing to 5. You can build on the 2, and 2 will become 3, 3 will become 4, 4 will become 5, rather than going, right, I'm going to do 5.
And I tell you what people need to do, if they can, is not feel guilty about the time they use planning and setting the goals. Because some of us, including me, perhaps say 2 years ago, or before I'd met you maybe, right? If you'd said to me, sit down and plan some small wins and get some consistency and get some habits, I would have felt that guilty that I wasn't flat out working on mortgages and protection, that I probably would have thought, right, I'd probably just dive into this mortgage again now, rather than realize the benefit of the planning, which will then save me time, money, effort, and hopefully make me some money as well to pay the bills. And so what might be nice for people is to just don't have any guilt about the planning, you know?
No,
don't have guilt about the planning. Take yourself away, and that 2 hours or 3 hours you spent, you'll get that back tenfold anyway once you get your consistency and new habits are in place. You'll be more, I would have thought, whatever the goal is, you'll be happier, healthier, or more efficient at whatever you're doing. And those 3 hours you'll get back anyway, and multiple times. So don't feel guilty about the fact that you're taking the time out to plan.
It's absolutely a massive point, Lee, because the thing is people, personal development is such a vital part of running a business or being a self-employed mortgage broker, part of a firm, whatever your setup or situation is. Personal development is massive. And so things about creating the right habits, like you said, taking the time out, looking at planning and preparation, you shouldn't feel guilty about that, because it's part of the business. And I'm not going to go through that. What is it that you're the most important part of the business, or whatever they could, like, you're the only thing that's important and all the rest of it. I'm not going to go through that, but it is about that personal development. And if you just go in with those lofty goals, boom and bust, nothing after week 3 kind of thing, going back to your old habits, which weren't right in the first place, then that's not personal development. Personal development is then building on those small wins. But you're seeing personal development as part of your business, not, like you said, not feeling guilty about that. If you want to listen to a podcast for half an hour, or read a book for half an hour, or do the things you want to do about personal development, don't feel guilty that it's, because I can't. It's funny because some of the feedback that I get on the podcast, and it's probably I am going off on a total tangent.
I'm going to go off on one in a minute as well on a tangent. So crack on. I'm enjoying yours at the moment.
So I can't. I'm a believer that you can't do 2 things at once. You just cannot. So if I've got a meeting with somebody and and then if you right now, you and I on this podcast, and you were checking your phone on your messages, you can't do it. It's like, you can't. It's 99% of the population cannot do 2 tasks at the same time. So going off on a tangent, but it is quite relevant, is that if I'm listening to a podcast or listening to an audio book, or people say to me, I listen to the podcast in the background while I'm working, which is fine. If that works for you, that's fine. I can't do it. Being honest, I can't do that. If I want to listen to a podcast and get the most out of it and take time to make notes and think about and reflect on it and the rest of it, and invest that 20 minutes, half an hour to listen to the podcast, I've got to listen to podcasts. I can't think, I'm just going to do some figures or submit an app and stuff like that, because I can't do it.
Well, that's
most of the population. That's saying most of the population can't do that either.
What I was going to come out of my mouth before you just said that was one size fits one size fits nobody when it comes to this. Everyone's got the different ways, haven't they, of taking on information. Now, in regards to your podcast, when I first started listening to it, and I still do, I used to take in the information better when I was out walking in the morning, because I'd get up, I'd go out walking, I had nothing else on my mind, and the only person, unfortunately for me, was you. in my,
I'm really
in
sorry,
my,
mate. I'm sorry about
no,
that.
you know what I mean? In your brilliant
The
guests.
dulcet Yorkshire tones of Craig Skelton. Oh,
Yeah,
mate, what
so
a great
I had
tomorrow.
you and your brilliant guests going straight in my ears when I had no other information in there, and I then retain some of that information, and then just try and implement it within my working week. But back to the the consistency and the wins. My way of doing things and your way of doing things are different, and so will everybody else's. But if they can implement what suits them best, then don't be scared to adapt and change it as you go along. If you think it's not working for you, as long as you're consistent in the weekly, monthly, daily routine, just work out what works best for you and just tweak it as you go. Don't feel guilty again about changing something if it's not working, because we're all adults. Just do what you want. As long as you're doing it, happy days.
Leigh, we're going to end on that. That's a great point to end on. I'm absolutely loving that. We said we were going to do these snippets at 15, 20 minutes. We've gone on a little bit and I've gone off on a tangent a little bit, but it's not a problem because obviously I think it's relevant to that. We've talked about wins this week and obviously the consistency. Next week, we're talking about decision fatigue. And I get quite passionate about decision as well because I think decisions and stuff like that, which obviously we'll probably go off on a tangent of that. And again, the emotional component as well with regards to habits and how that makes them more sustainable as well. So we are dissecting it. We're doing it week by week in small chunks. We've talked about wins. We've talked about obviously consistency, gone off on a tangent. But Leigh, thank you for being a guest on the second episode of the habits for the new year. And yeah, and I'm looking forward to getting you back on next week.
Oh, as usual. Thank you very much, Craig. Great to see you and great to have a chat as well. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thanks, Leigh, for being part of the second episode and the whole series about habits to kickstart the podcast in 2024. I hope you got something from that podcast. Like I said, we talked about the small wins and consistency. We've obviously got next week coming up, which is part 3 in the series, which we talk about decision fatigue and the emotional component with regards to habits as well. And so, yeah, we're going to get into a bit more detail about that and obviously go off on a tangent as always. Thank you to everyone who has listened and subscribed so far. And as always, don't forget to run your own race.